The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Valley as Jake Morrison knelt beside the ancient John Deere, his oil-stained hands trembling as they held the yellowed envelope. Inside, documents bearing official seals from 1882 revealed property, boundaries that would rewrite everything the county thought it knew about land ownership. The elderly man sitting on his porch rocker watched with knowing eyes as Jake's face transformed from confusion to astonishment, realizing that what started as a neighborly favor had just uncovered the biggest secret in Kansas farming history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, Jake Morrison had been staring at the stack of overdue bills on his kitchen table when 11-year-old Emma walked in from school. Her backpack hit the floor with the familiar thud that marked the end of another school day, but her usual cheerfulness seemed muted. She slid into the chair across from him, her math homework already in hand, pretending not to notice the utility notice with final warning stamped in red. The Morrison household had operated on a delicate balance since Claire's death 2 years ago. Jake had left his position as construction foreman to be more present for Emma, taking whatever local handyman jobs he could find. Their 5-acre plot, inherited from his father, provided just enough space for a vegetable garden and a small workshop where Jake repaired equipment for neighbors who couldn't afford the dealership prices in Millfield. Mr. Brennan's tractor broke down again, Emma mentioned casually. Pencil paused over her fractions. I saw him trying to push it back to the barn when the bus dropped me off. Jake glanced through the window toward the Brennan farm, their closest neighbor, a quarter-mile down the dirt road. Walter Brennan, at 82, had been farming his 120 acres alone since his wife Grace passed 5 years ago. No children, no family that anyone knew of, just an old man and his memories rattling around in a farmhouse that had stood for over a century. That old international harvester finally gave up? Jake asked, already reaching for his toolbox keys. Emma nodded. He looked really tired, Dad, like when Grandpa used to get after working too long in the heat. The comparison hit Jake harder than his daughter probably intended. His own father had worked himself into an early grave, trying to keep their small farm afloat during the agricultural crisis of the late 90s. Jake had promised himself he wouldn't follow that path, but here he was, juggling bills and odd jobs, watching his daughter grow up too fast and too aware of their financial struggles. Finish your homework, Jake said, grabbing his toolkit. I'll go see what Walt needs. There's leftover casserole in the fridge for dinner. The walk to Brennan's farm took Jake past the weathered fence posts that marked property lines older than the state itself. Cedar Valley had been settled in the 1870s when the railroad brought dreams of prosperity to the Kansas prairie. Walt's grandfather had been among the first homesteaders, claiming land through the railroad grants that opened up the territory. Jake found Walt sitting on his porch, still in his work clothes, despite the obvious defeat in his posture. The broken tractor sat halfway between the barn and the field, like a tired horse that had simply decided it could go no further. "Afternoon, Walt," Jake called out, setting his toolkit on the porch steps. "Emma says your tractor's giving you trouble." Walt's weathered face creased into a weary smile. "That's one way to put it. Things older than you are, Jake. Probably time I just sold the whole operation to those Meridian Development folks. They've been calling every week." Jake had heard about Meridian's aggressive expansion into Cedar Valley. The company, headquartered in Kansas City, specialized in converting agricultural land into shopping centers and suburban developments. They'd already bought out 6 farms in the past year, promising farmers comfortable retirements while systematically dismantling the agricultural heritage of the region. "Let me take a look before you make any decisions," Jake offered. "Could be something simple." Walt waved dismissively. "Transmission's shot. Has been for months. I've been nursing it along, but she finally gave up the ghost. Would cost more to fix than the tractor's worth. Jake walked to the disabled machine, running his hands over the faded red paint and rust spots that marked decades of faithful service. The International Harvester 574 wasn't just old, it was a piece of history, one of the last tractors manufactured before the agricultural crisis that had transformed American farming. "Mind if I pop the hood?" Jake asked. "Knock yourself out," Walt replied, "but I'm telling you she's done." As Jake began his inspection, he noticed details that contradicted Walt's assessment. The transmission fluid was clean, recently changed. The belts showed normal wear but weren't critical. The engine, when he turned the key, tried to turn over with surprising vigor for a supposedly dead machine. "Walt," Jake called back to the porch, "when's the last time you had this serviced?" The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, I tinker with it now and then." "Why?" Jake's mechanical instincts, honed through years of construction work and equipment repair, detected something deeper than routine maintenance. The tractor had been modified, subtly but expertly. Non-standard parts, custom fabrication work that suggested someone with serious engineering knowledge had been maintaining this machine far beyond normal farm requirements. "Your transmission seems fine," Jake announced, confusion evident in his voice. "The issue might be in the linkage. Mind if I check underneath?" Walt stood up with surprising agility for his age. "Actually, Jake, maybe we should call it a day. I appreciate you coming over, but—" "Dad!" Emma's voice carried across the field as she ran toward them, backpack bouncing. "Dad, you forgot your phone. Mom's lawyer is calling about the insurance thing." Jake's heart sank. The life insurance dispute had been dragging on for 2 years, the company claiming technicalities to avoid paying out Claire's policy. It was another weight on the stack of financial burdens threatening to bury them. "I should take this," Jake apologized to Walt, "but I can come back tomorrow morning, get this sorted out." Walt's expression shifted, something unreadable passing across his features. "Tomorrow morning would be fine," he said quietly. "Early, if you can manage it. Before I might change my mind about selling." That evening, Jake sat with Emma at their kitchen table, helping her with math homework, while his mind churned through the day's events. Something about Walt's tractor situation didn't add up. The modifications, the old man's reluctance to let him dig deeper, the sudden urgency about possibly selling to Meridian. "Dad," Emma said, breaking his reverie, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Brennan doesn't have any family, does he?" "Not that I know of, sweetheart." "Why?" "He just seems lonely, and his house is so big for just one person." She paused, pencil tapping against her workbook. "What happens to farms when the owners don't have anyone to leave them to?" The question was more complex than Emma probably realized. In Cedar Valley, as in many rural communities, land ownership was often tangled in decades of informal agreements, family trusts, and legal arrangements that predated modern record-keeping. When farmers died without clear heirs, their land often fell into legal limbo, making it easy prey for development companies with teams of lawyers. "Usually the state figures out what to do with it," Jake simplified. "Sometimes distant relatives show up, sometimes the land gets sold." "That's sad," Emma remarked. "Mr. Brennan's family has had that farm forever. It should stay a farm, shouldn't it?" Jake didn't have a good answer for that. The economic realities of modern agriculture made it increasingly difficult for small farms to survive. Meridian's offers, while destroying the agricultural character of the region, provided financial security that many elderly farmers couldn't refuse. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Jake recognized the number, Tom Hawley from the hardware store. "Jake, you got a minute?" Tom's voice carried an urgency Jake wasn't used to hearing from his usually laid-back friend. "Something You should know about those Meridian people. What's going on? They were in here today, asking about property surveys, specifically about the old railroad grants. Mike O'Brien from the courthouse was with them, looking nervous as hell. They were real interested in the Brennan property and yours. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Our place? Why would they care about 5 acres? That's just it, Tom continued. They had these old maps, stuff I've never seen before. They kept talking about original boundaries and unclaimed sections. Jake, I think something's going on with the land titles in this whole area. After hanging up, Jake found himself staring out the window toward Walt's farm. The old man's lights were still on, unusual for someone who typically followed farmers' hours. The broken tractor sat silhouetted against the darkening sky, a mechanical mystery wrapped in larger questions about land, legacy, and the future of Cedar Valley. That night, Jake lay awake thinking about his father, about the promises made and broken in pursuit of the American agricultural dream. His dad had always said the land held secrets, that every farm had stories buried deeper than any plow could reach. Jake had dismissed it as romantic nonsense from a man too attached to tradition. But now, with Meridians circling like vultures, and Walt's strange behavior nagging at his mind, Jake wondered if his father had known something more concrete than mere sentiment. The next morning arrived with unusual fog for late September, the kind that turned familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions. Jake left Emma at the bus stop and headed to Walt's farm, his toolkit in hand, but his mind full of questions that had nothing to do with mechanical repair. He found Walt already outside, standing by the tractor with a cup of coffee steaming in. The cool morning air. The old man looked like he hadn't slept, his clothes the same as yesterday. "Morning, Walt," Jake called out. "Ready to get this old girl running?" Walt turned, and Jake saw something in his eyes, determination mixed with what might have been relief. "Morning, Jake. Before you start, there's something I need to tell you about this tractor, about this land, and about why Meridian is really interested in Cedar Valley." Jake set down his toolkit, sensing they were about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. "I'm listening." Walt took a deep breath, his gaze drifting across the fields his family had worked for generations. "My grandfather wasn't just a farmer, Jake. He was a surveyor for the Kansas Pacific Railway. And what he discovered about the original land grants, well, let's just say the official records don't tell the whole story." The fog began to lift as Walt spoke, revealing the landscape of Cedar Valley in a new light. Every fence post, every property line, every deed and title that defined the community structure was about to be called into question. And at the center of it all sat an old tractor with a broken transmission, or so everyone believed. "The tractor," Walt continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "isn't really broken, it's locked, and what's inside, it's going to change everything." Jake stepped closer, his heart rate accelerating. "What are you talking about, Walt?" The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out an antique key, its brass surface worn smooth by generations of handling. "The reason I've been maintaining this tractor all these years isn't for farming. It's because my grandfather built a hidden compartment into it, a safe place for documents that certain people would have killed to destroy." As the morning sun burned through the last of the fog, Walt inserted the key into what looked like a standard maintenance panel on the tractor's side. With a series of clicks that spoke of precision engineering, a section of the housing swung, open to reveal a concealed space. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved against time, lay a stack of documents that would rewrite the history of Cedar Valley. Jake reached in with trembling hands, his mind already racing with implications he couldn't fully grasp. The first document he unfolded bore the official seal of the U.S. Department of the Interior, dated 1882. As Jake read the faded text, his understanding of everything His own family's land, Walt's farm, the entire structure of property ownership in the county began to shift like tectonic plates. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that seemed to divide the world into what was known and what was about to be revealed. And in that moment, standing beside an old tractor that held secrets older than living memory, Jake Morrison realized that his simple favor for an elderly neighbor had just opened a door to the biggest legal revelation in Kansas history. The fog had lifted completely now, but the mystery was just beginning to unfold. The document spread across Walt's kitchen table told a story that made Jake's head spin. Survey maps from 1882 showed property boundaries that bore no resemblance to current county records. Land grants signed by railroad officials allocated parcels in patterns that defied the neat rectangular plots everyone in Cedar Valley took for granted. Most shocking of all were the notes in the margins, written in precise handwriting that detailed how subsequent surveys had been altered to benefit specific buyers. "My grandfather knew they were falsifying records," Walt explained, pouring fresh coffee into chipped mugs. "The railroad companies were supposed to alternate sections with government land for homesteaders. Instead, they manipulated surveys to create larger contiguous parcels they could sell to wealthy speculators." Jake traced his finger along a boundary line that cut directly through what was now downtown Cedar Valley. This shows the original town site as part of a 640-acre parcel that was supposed to be divided among 12 families, including yours, Walt pointed to a notation. "The Morrisons were promised 50 acres along Cedar Creek. Your current 5 acres? That's just the portion they couldn't figure out how to steal without making the fraud too obvious." The weight of this revelation settled on Jake's shoulders like lead. His father had spent his life struggling to make 5 acres profitable, never knowing he was entitled to 10 times that amount. The financial stress that had contributed to his early death, the constant pressure that had defined Jake's own childhood, all of it based on a lie preserved for over a century. "Why didn't your grandfather expose this?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Walt's weathered hands shook slightly as he handled the fragile documents. "Because they would have killed him. 3 surveyors who questioned the official records died in accidents within 2 years. My grandfather chose to preserve the evidence and stay alive to protect it." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of an ancient clock on the wall. Jake studied the maps more carefully, noting how current property lines had been drawn to obscure the original grants. The Brennan farm itself should have extended another 200 acres to the east, encompassing what was now the proposed site for Meridian's shopping complex. "Meridian knows about this," Jake said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why they're pushing so hard to buy up land before anyone discovers the truth." Walt nodded grimly. Someone tipped them off. Maybe found references in old courthouse documents or heard family stories that were dismissed as folklore. They're trying to secure legal possession before the original grants can be validated. The morning sun streaming through Walt's kitchen. Windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, giving the scene an almost dreamlike quality. But the implications were starkly real. If these documents were authentic, and the official seals and period-appropriate paper suggested they were, then land worth millions of dollars had been stolen from Cedar Valley's founding families. "We need to verify these," Jake said, his construction foreman instincts kicking in. "Get them authenticated by experts who can't be bought by Meridian." "Already thought of that," Walt replied, reaching for another folder. "But there's more you need to see first." The next set of documents made Jake's blood run cold. Corporate registration papers from the 1920s showed a company called Midwest Agricultural Development, Meridian's predecessor, had been formed by the sons of the same railroad officials who had orchestrated the original fraud. Internal memorandums from the 1950s, discuss strategies for maintaining the false surveys and discrediting any challenges. 3 generations of the same families have been profiting from this theft, Walt explained. They've had lawyers and politicians on payroll, ensuring the fraudulent records remained official. My family has been watching, waiting for the right moment to expose it all. Jake felt anger building in his chest. And you chose now, when they're about to complete their takeover of the entire valley. Walt's eyes met his with surprising intensity. I chose you, Jake. Your father knew something was wrong, but could never prove it. He spent years researching old records, asking questions that made powerful people nervous. When he died, I thought the knowledge might die with him. But then you came back to Cedar Valley and I saw the same determination in you. The revelation that his father had been investigating this conspiracy added another layer to Jake's grief. How many nights had his dad spent poring over documents, sensing the truth but lacking the evidence Walt had hidden in his tractor? There's a legal principle called adverse possession, Walt continued, pulling out a law book marked with dozens of sticky notes. If someone occupies land openly for a certain period, they can claim ownership. But it doesn't apply if the original taking was fraudulent. These documents prove the fraud, which means the original grants are still valid. Jake's mind raced through the implications. Dozens of families in Cedar Valley were farming parcels of what should be their own land. The Turner Ranch, the Martinez, Produce operation, even the land under the elementary school, all of it built on stolen ground. We need help, Jake said. Legal expertise, historical verification, protection from whatever Meridian will do when they realize we have this evidence. Walt reached for the phone, an old rotary model that seemed appropriate for the historical weight of their situation. There's someone we need to call. A woman who specializes in historical property disputes. She's been waiting for my call for 5 years. As Walt dialed, Jake noticed movement outside the window. A black SUV was parked at the end of the drive, just visible through the oak trees that lined the property entrance. His instincts, sharpened by years on construction sites where safety meant constant vigilance, triggered immediate alarm. "Walt," he said quietly, "we have company." The old man followed his gaze, then calmly hung up the phone. "They've been watching since yesterday, probably saw you find the compartment this morning." "Then they know." "They suspect," Walt corrected. "But suspicion isn't knowledge. The question is what they'll do about it." As if in answer, 2 more vehicles pulled up behind the first. Men in suits emerged, their bearings suggesting something between corporate executives and private. Security. Jake recognized the type from construction sites, where union disputes turned ugly. Professionals hired to apply pressure without quite crossing legal lines. "We need to secure these documents," Jake said, already moving to gather the papers. Walt was ahead of him, producing a scanner from a closet. "Way ahead of you. I've been digitizing everything for months, uploading to secure servers. But the originals are what count in court." The knock on the door came. As they were placing documents in a fireproof safe, Walt pulled from under the floorboards. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor, but the authoritative pound of someone used to being answered immediately. "Mr. Brennan, this is David Sterling from Meridian Development. We need to discuss your property." Walt and Jake exchanged glances. The CEO himself had come, indicating how seriously Meridian took this threat to their plans. "What do we do?" Jake whispered. "We let them in," Walt replied, locking the safe and sliding the rug back over the floorboards. "But first, you should call Tom Hawley. Tell him to gather the others at the community center. Use the old code. Say you need help with a barn raising." Jake pulled out his phone. Understanding the message would alert their neighbors to a community emergency without tipping off anyone who might be monitoring communications. As he dialed, Walt moved toward the door with the measured pace of an elderly farmer who wouldn't be rushed by city folks. "Mr. Sterling," Walt said as he opened the door, rather early for a social call. David Sterling stood on the porch like he owned it already. Mid-40s, expensive suit, practiced smile that didn't reach calculating eyes. Two associates flanked him, their function deliberately ambiguous. "Mr. Brennan, I apologize for the early hour, but time-sensitive opportunities require prompt action. May we come in?" Walt stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Coffee's fresh if you're interested." As the Meridian team entered, Jake finished his call to Tom and pocketed his phone. He recognized Sterling's type from years in construction, developers who viewed communities as assets to be optimized rather than places where people built lives. "Mr. Morrison," Sterling acknowledged Jake with surprise he didn't quite conceal. "I wasn't aware you had business with Mr. Brennan this morning." "Just neighborly help with equipment," Jake replied evenly. "Walt's tractor needed attention." Sterling's smile widened fractionally. "How fortunate. We were just discussing how Mr. Brennan might benefit from retiring from such demanding maintenance responsibilities." They settled around the kitchen table where survey maps had been spread minutes before. Now, only coffee mugs and a week-old newspaper occupied the scarred wood surface. Sterling's associates remained standing, positioned where they could observe. The entire room. "I'll get straight to the point," Sterling began, producing a folder from his briefcase. "Meridian is prepared to offer you 30% above the assessed value for your property, Mr. Brennan. Full payment within 30 days, plus a generous pension supplement for your retirement years." Walt's expression remained neutral as he reviewed the figures. "That's considerably more than your last offer." "We've reassessed the strategic value of your location," Sterling replied smoothly. "The development potential has increased significantly with our expanded plans for Cedar Valley." Jake watched the interplay while mentally cataloging details. Sterling's shoes showed dust from somewhere other than Walt's gravel drive. One associate kept glancing toward the barn where the tractor was parked. They knew something, but not everything. "And if I'm not interested in selling?" Walt asked mildly. Sterling's demeanor shifted subtly. "Mr. Brennan, I hope you'll consider the broader implications. Development is coming to Cedar Valley, whether individual owners participate or not. Those who partner with us early benefit most. Those who resist..." He spread his hands in a gesture suggesting inevitable consequences. "Find themselves isolated as progress moves around them," Walt finished. "Yes, I've heard the speech." "It's not a speech, it's reality," Sterling pressed. "Your neighbors are selling. The Turner Ranch closed yesterday. The school board is considering our offer for new facilities. Cedar Valley is evolving and you need my land to make it work," Walt interrupted. "The water rights, the access roads, the elevation for your shopping center's foundation. Without the Brennan property, your whole project faces significant complications." Sterling's composure flickered. "You seem remarkably well informed about our development plans." "I pay attention," Walt replied. "My family has been watching this land for 5 generations. We know every creek, every survey marker, every property line." The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. Jake noticed one of the associates subtly shifting position, hand moving toward his jacket in a way that suggested more than corporate. Intimidation might be in play. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately," Sterling suggested, glancing pointedly at Jake. "Jake stays," Walt said firmly. "He's helping me evaluate all my options." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Mr. Brennan, I strongly advise you to consider our offer carefully. The alternative methods for acquiring necessary properties can be complicated. Liens for unpaid taxes, code violations, eminent domain proceedings. The legal system offers many paths to the same destination." "Are you threatening me?" Walt asked, his voice steady despite his age. "I'm explaining reality," Sterling replied. "Meridian has resources and patience. We can make your remaining years comfortable or complicated. The choice is yours." Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Tom. "Everyone gathering, bring proof." "I need time to consider," Walt said, standing with deliberate slowness. "My attorney will want to review any offers." Sterling rose as well, his associates moving to flank him. "Time is a luxury, Mr. Brennan. Our offer expires at midnight tonight. After that, we pursue other options." As the Meridian team prepared to leave, Sterling paused at the door. "One more thing. We're aware some people have been spreading stories about historical claims to land in this area. Old surveys, disputed boundaries, that sort of thing. I hope you understand that entertaining such fantasies would be inadvisable. The courts take a dim view of fraudulent challenges to established property rights." The threat hung in the air like smoke. After the door closed behind them, Jake and Walt watched through the window as the vehicles departed, leaving dust clouds that seemed to linger ominously. "They know," Jake said. "They suspect," Walt corrected again. "But they just revealed how scared they are. Sterling wouldn't have come personally unless they believed we have something that could derail their entire project." Jake thought about the documents now locked in Walt's safe, evidence that could reshape the entire county's understanding of property ownership. What do we do now? Walt moved with surprising energy for his age, retrieving the safe and preparing to transport the documents. "Now we share the truth with people who have a right to know it. Your father would have wanted the community to decide its own fate, not have it dictated by thieves and their descendants." As they loaded the precious documents into Jake's truck, he noticed the tractor sitting in the morning sun. Its hidden compartment had protected secrets for generations, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. That moment had arrived, brought forth not by grand design, but by simple neighborly assistance, one man helping another with broken equipment. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Meridian's aggressive tactics had ultimately triggered the very revelation they feared. If they had been content with gradual acquisition, Walt might have carried his secrets to the grave. Instead, their pressure had forced the old man to trust someone with his family's protected knowledge. As they drove toward the community center, Jake caught Walt's reflection in the rearview mirror. The elderly farmer gazed out at the passing fields with an expression of profound relief, as if a burden carried for decades was finally being lifted. The morning fog had completely burned off now, leaving Cedar Valley bathed in clear autumn sunlight. Every field, every fence line, every building stood revealed in sharp detail. Soon, the truth about the land itself would be equally exposed, and nothing in Cedar Valley would ever be the same. Behind them, the tractor sat silent in the barnyard, its secret compartment empty for the first time in living memory. But its purpose had been fulfilled. The documents it had protected were now in motion, carried by men determined to right historical wrongs and restore what had been stolen from an entire community. The road to the community center stretched ahead, leading not just to a gathering of neighbors, but to a reckoning with the past that would determine Cedar Valley's future. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter, aware that he was driving toward a confrontation that had been building for over a century. In the truck bed, secured in Walt's fireproof safe, lay papers that would transform everything. Survey maps that revealed truth, documents that exposed lies, evidence that would challenge power, and at the center of it all, two men, one young, one old, united by their determination to see justice done. The community center came into view in the distance, and Jake could already see pickup trucks gathering in the parking lot. The barn-raising code had worked. Cedar Valley was assembling to face its moment of truth. The Cedar Valley Community Center occupied a converted grain warehouse that had served the farming community since 1923. Its weathered brick walls and high ceilings designed for storing wheat now sheltered a different kind of harvest, the gathering of neighbors whose families had worked this land for generations. By the time Jake and Walt arrived, more than 30 vehicles filled the gravel parking lot, their owners drawn by the emergency code that signaled something more serious than equipment failure or storm damage. Tom Hawley met them at the entrance, his usually jovial expression replaced by concern. "Half the valley's here already," he reported. "Word spread fast. Bill Tucker says Meridian offered him double market value for his dairy operation this morning. Rosa Martinez got a similar call about her organic fields. They're moving on, everyone at once. They're trying to lock down sales before we can organize," Jake observed, helping Walt unload the safe containing the documents. Sterling knows something's shifted. Inside, the familiar space had transformed into an impromptu war room. Folding, tables bore coffee urns and pastries from Sarah Coleman's diner, while clusters of farmers engaged in heated discussions. The morning light filtering through high windows illuminated faces marked by worry and determination. People who had weathered droughts, market crashes, and government policies, now facing perhaps their greatest challenge. "About time you showed up," Rosa Martinez called out, her direct manner reflecting years of fighting to establish her organic operation against conventional farming pressure. "Bill's actually considering Meridian's offer, says it's enough to set up his kids for college, and then some." Bill Tucker, whose family had run dairy cattle on the same land since 1908, looked uncomfortable under the community's scrutiny. "It's not easy saying no to that kind of money," he defended. "My equipment's aging, milk prices are down, and my oldest doesn't want to farm. What am I supposed to do?" The dilemma resonated through the room. Every family present faced similar pressures: aging infrastructure, uncertain markets, children drawn to easier lives in cities. Meridian's offers provided escape routes from struggles that seemed increasingly unsustainable. "Before anyone makes decisions, you need to see something," Walt announced, his voice carrying with unexpected authority. The conversations stilled. As the community patriarch moved to the center of the room, Jake following with the safe, Sarah Coleman stepped forward. "Walt Brennan, what's this about? The message said barn raising, but this feels like something else entirely." Walt's gaze swept the assembled faces, neighbors he'd known for decades, children of friends long past, newcomers who'd married into farming families. "How many of you know the real history of Cedar Valley's land grants?" The question prompted confused glances and murmured discussions. Local history was a source of pride, stories passed down through generations about homesteading ancestors and railroad development. But Walt's tone suggested deeper currents beneath familiar narratives. "My grandfather worked for the Kansas Pacific Railway as a surveyor," Walt began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "He was part of the team that mapped original land grants when the railroad opened this territory. What he discovered was systematic fraud that cheated your ancestors, our ancestors, out of thousands of acres." The room erupted in startled exclamations. Jake watched as disbelief warred with curiosity on faces throughout the crowd. This wasn't the kind of claim someone like Walt Brennan made lightly. "That's a serious accusation," Henry Park spoke, up his Christmas tree farm representing one of the newer operations in the valley. "You're talking about official government records, legal documents that have stood for over a century." "I'm talking about falsified documents," Walt corrected, nodding to Jake, who began removing papers from the safe. "Surveys that were altered, boundaries that were moved, entire sections that disappeared from official maps to benefit railroad executives and their partners." "Utile." As Jake spread the original survey maps across the central table, people pressed closer to examine them. The detailed drawings, authenticated by official seals and signatures, showed a very different Cedar Valley from the one they knew. Property, Lines crossed current boundaries, allocations exceeded existing holdings, and notations in the margins documented discrepancies that had been systematically concealed. "This shows my family was granted 160 acres, Rosa breathed, tracing lines that encompassed not just her current 40-acre organic operation, but adjacent properties now owned by others. "We've been farming a quarter of what was promised." Similar revelations rippled through the crowd as farmers identified their ancestral names on original allocations. The Tuckers should have received 320 acres, not the 120 they'd struggled to maintain. The Morrison property, Jake felt his throat tighten, originally comprised 50 acres of prime bottomland along Cedar Creek, not the marginal 5 acres his family had worked themselves to exhaustion trying to make profitable. "How is this possible?" Sarah Coleman demanded. Her diner sat on what the maps showed as part of the original townsite commons, designated for public use rather than private development. "These are legal documents. Why weren't they honored?" Walt pulled out the corporate papers showing Midwest Agricultural Development's formation. "Because the same people who falsified the surveys created companies to profit from the fraud. They bought off officials, destroyed competing records, and eliminated anyone who asked too many questions. The historical conspiracy took shape through testimony and evidence. 3 surveyors who had protested the alterations died in suspicious circumstances. County records from the 1890s showed pages torn from ledgers, entire sections rewritten. A pattern emerged of deliberate, coordinated deception designed to concentrate land ownership while maintaining the appearance of legitimate homesteading." "And Meridian?" Tom Hawley asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Is the direct corporate descendant of the original conspirators," Jake confirmed, showing the paper trail that connected modern development interests to historical theft. "The same families who stole the land in the 1880s are now trying to complete their consolidation of Cedar Valley. The implications settled over the assembly like lead blankets. Generations of struggle, families broken by financial pressure, dreams deferred or abandoned, all stemming from an original sin of greed and deception that had shaped the valley's entire history." Bill Tucker sank into a chair, his face pale. "My great-grandfather killed himself in 1932, thought he'd failed the family when he couldn't make the farm pay. But if we'd had our full allotment..." Similar stories emerged as the morning progressed. Families forced to sell portions of already reduced holdings during hard times. Farmers who'd worked themselves into early graves trying to squeeze profitability from inadequate acreage. Children who'd left for cities because the land couldn't support multiple generations. "They stole more than land," Rosa said quietly. "They stole our futures." The anger in the room was palpable but controlled. The cold fury of people who had endured injustice while believing it was merely misfortune. Jake watched as neighbors who had competed for resources realized they'd been manipulated into scarcity by those who had abundance. "What can we do about it?" Henry Park asked the practical question. "These documents are compelling, but Meridian has lawyers, political connections, resources we can't match. They'll claim adverse possession, statute of limitations, whatever legal doctrines protect established ownership." Walt produced the law book he'd shown Jake earlier. "Fraud vitiates everything," he quoted. "No statutory protection applies to ownership based on fraudulent taking. If we can prove the original surveys were deliberately falsified, and these documents do exactly that, then every subsequent transfer based on those false boundaries is legally void." The legal theory was sound, but everyone understood the practical challenges. Meridian wouldn't simply accept such claims. Court battles could drag on for years, draining resources the farming community didn't have. And Sterling had already demonstrated the company's willingness to use intimidation and pressure tactics. "There's something else," Jake interjected, remembering Sterling's morning visit. Meridian knows about these documents, or at least suspects their existence. That's why they're pushing so hard for immediate sales. They're trying to establish facts on the ground before we can mount a legal challenge. Tom Hawley stood up, his hardware store owner's pragmatism cutting through emotional responses. Then we need to move fast, document everything, secure legal representation, and most importantly, stick together. They're counting on picking us off individually. Nods of agreement circulated, but Jake noticed hesitation on some faces. The financial pressure was real, the offers tempting. Unity was easy to proclaim, but harder to maintain when children needed college funds and equipment required replacement. "I have a proposal," Walt announced, surprising everyone, including Jake. "My farm sits on what should be community land according to these original surveys. If our legal challenge succeeds, I'll deed it to a community trust, keep it in agriculture, prevent development, ensure it serves Cedar Valley's needs rather than outside interests." The generous gesture sparked immediate discussion. If Walt Brennan, whose family had as much claim to expanded holdings as anyone, was willing to share recovered land for community benefit, it established a precedent for collective action rather than individual gain. "We need someone to coordinate this," Sarah said, ever practical. "Legal research, document preservation, community communication. Someone Meridian can't buy off or intimidate." Eyes turned to Jake, whose return to Cedar Valley and connection to Walt's revelations positioned him uniquely. He thought of Emma, of the legacy he wanted to leave her, not just 5 acres of struggle, but a community that controlled its own destiny. "I'll do it," he committed. "But we all need to understand what we're facing. Meridian won't just fight in court. They'll use every tool available: economic pressure, political influence, media manipulation. This could get ugly." Bill Tucker raised his hand. "I'm withdrawing from negotiations with Meridian," he announced. "My family's been here 5 generations. If there's a chance to reclaim what was stolen, I owe it to my ancestors and my children to try." One by one, others made similar commitments. Not everyone. Some remained silent, clearly torn between community solidarity and immediate financial needs. But enough spoke up to create momentum, a critical mass of resistance that would make Meridian's individual targeting strategy more difficult. As the meeting evolved into planning sessions, Jake found himself at the center of organizing committees. Legal research groups formed to validate documents and explore precedents. Communication teams prepared to share findings with extended families and absent landowners. Security protocols emerged to protect evidence and prevent intimidation. Margaret Chen's name surfaced repeatedly, a property law expert who specialized in historical land disputes, someone who had contacted Walt years earlier after publishing academic papers on railroad-era fraud. Contact information was shared, calls planned, strategies developed. Outside, Jake noticed vehicles circulating slowly past the community center. Not local traffic, sleek SUVs with tinted windows that screamed corporate surveillance. Meridian was watching, trying to gauge the community's response to morning pressure tactics. "They're getting nervous," Tom observed, joining Jake at the window. "Good. Nervous people make mistakes. Desperate people do dangerous things," Jake countered. "We need to be careful. Everyone here has vulnerabilities: families, businesses, debts. Meridian will exploit whatever leverage they can find." The truth of that assessment became clear as the morning progressed. Several farmers received calls during the meeting. Banks, suddenly concerned about loan terms, suppliers questioning credit arrangements, mysterious code violations appearing on properties that had operated without issue for decades. The corporate machine was activating its network of influence. By noon, the community center had transformed into a command post for what everyone understood was more than a legal dispute. This was a battle for Cedar Valley's soul, a chance to correct historical injustices and reclaim self-determination from forces that had manipulated the community for over a century. Jake helped Walt secure the original documents in the community center's old vault, a remnant from its grain storage, days that would provide better protection than individual homes. Copies were distributed to multiple holders, digital versions uploaded to secure servers, authentication processes initiated with historical preservation societies. "Your father would be proud," Walt said quietly as they worked. He suspected something like this, but never had the proof. "You're completing work he started decades ago." The connection to his father's unfinished investigation added personal weight to Jake's involvement. How many nights had his dad spent researching in the county courthouse, sensing patterns that didn't align with official narratives? How much of the family's financial struggle stemmed from fighting a rigged system without understanding its origins? As the initial meeting concluded and farmers prepared to return to their operations, a new atmosphere pervaded the community center. Where morning had brought individual anxiety about Meridian's offers, afternoon carried collective purpose. Not everyone was fully committed, human nature and financial pressure guaranteed. Some would eventually yield to corporate incentives. But enough stood firm to create a foundation for resistance. Jake walked outside with Tom and found Emma waiting by his truck. School had released early for teacher conferences, and she'd walked from the bus stop, drawn by the unusual gathering. "Dad, what's happening? Everyone looks so serious." Jake knelt beside his daughter, considering how to explain the morning's revelations. "Remember when you asked about Mr. Brennan's farm and what happens to land when families don't have anyone to leave it to?" Emma nodded, her intelligent eyes focused on his face. "Well, we learned today that a lot of land in Cedar Valley was taken from families a long time ago, unfairly. Now we have a chance to make it right, but it's going to be complicated. Like when Bobby Stevens took my lunch money and the principal made him give it back." Jake smiled at the simple analogy that captured complex truth. "Yes, sweetheart, except this involves a lot more lunch money, and the people who took it have friends in high places." As they drove home, past fields that might soon be reclaimed by rightful heirs, Jake contemplated the journey ahead. The morning had started with him helping an elderly neighbor with a broken tractor. By afternoon, he found himself at the center of a movement that could reshape an entire county's understanding of property, justice, and community. The tractor still sat in Walt's barnyard, its hidden compartment now empty, but its purpose fulfilled. The documents it had protected were now in motion, their revelations rippling through Cedar Valley like seismic waves. Whatever came next, legal battles, corporate retaliation, community divisions, the truth was now free. And sometimes, Jake reflected as his daughter chatted about school beside him, truth was enough to change everything. The question was whether Cedar Valley had the courage and unity to see that change through to its conclusion. Behind them, storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising afternoon rain. But for the first time in years, Jake faced approaching storms with something more than resignation. He had purpose now, and community, and evidence that might finally balance scales that had been weighted against families like his for over a century. The road home stretched before them, familiar yet somehow different. Every fence post, every field boundary, every property line now told a different story, not of legitimate ownership and natural struggle, but of theft and deception preserved across generations. The challenge now was to write a new chapter in Cedar Valley's history, one based on truth rather than lies. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed forward. The easy path would be to accept Meridian's offers, take the money and let sleeping dogs lie. But easy paths rarely led to justice, and Jake had learned from his father that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. Especially then, the woman who stepped out of the rental car at Walt's farmhouse. 3 days later didn't match anyone's preconceptions of a high-powered attorney. Margaret Chen wore practical boots, jeans, and a Cornell University sweatshirt that had seen better days. Her expertise in historical property law came wrapped in the approachable demeanor of someone who understood that legal battles were ultimately about people, not precedents. "Mr. Brennan," she greeted Walt warmly, then turned to Jake. "Mr. Morrison, I've been waiting 5 years for this call. Your documents are exactly what I've been searching for." They gathered in Walt's kitchen where the journey had begun, now joined by Tom Hawley and Rosa Martinez, representing the community's coordinating committee. Margaret spread her own research across the table: academic papers, historical analyses, and legal briefs that complemented the evidence hidden in the tractor. "I've documented similar fraud patterns in 6 other railroad territories," she explained, "but none had preserved evidence as complete as yours. The Brennan documents are the smoking gun that can validate claims across multiple states." Her excitement was tempered by realistic assessment of the challenges ahead. Meridian has already filed preliminary motions to block any historical challenges to land titles. They're claiming statute of limitations, adverse possession, and documentary reliability issues. We need to move strategically. Over the next hours, Margaret outlined a legal strategy that went beyond individual property claims. By establishing the systematic nature of the fraud, they could potentially trigger federal investigation into interstate commerce violations. The railroad land grants had been authorized by Congress. Falsifying them constituted fraud against the United States government. "The key is proving continuity," Margaret emphasized. "We need to show that Meridian knowingly perpetuated fraudulent claims, that they understood the original surveys were falsified but continued to profit from them." Jake thought about Sterling's visit, his threat about stories concerning historical claims. They definitely know. Sterling all but admitted it when he warned us against challenging established property rights. "We'll need more than implications," Margaret cautioned. "But there are ways to establish knowledge. Corporate archives, depositions, internal communications. Discovery will be revealing if we can get that far." The legal campaign began quietly but systematically. Margaret filed initial motions in federal court, bypassing local jurisdictions where Meridian's influence ran deep. The community established a legal defense fund, with even struggling farmers contributing what they could. The unity forged at the community center hardened into practical organization, but Meridian's response came swiftly and ruthlessly. Within days of the first filings, Cedar Valley experienced what could only be described as corporate warfare. Jake arrived at the elementary school to find Emma in tears. "They said we might have to move," she sobbed, "that you're causing trouble and the bank might take our house." The foreclosure notice had arrived that morning. The bank suddenly, concerned about irregularities in Jake's mortgage, demanding immediate payment of technical violations that had been ignored for years. Similar pressure hit other families involved in the legal challenge. Credit lines were cancelled, loans called due, insurance policies questioned. "They're trying to break us financially before we can get to court," Tom reported at an emergency committee meeting. His hardware store faced supplier boycotts organized by Meridian's network. 3 major distributors cut me off this week, said they couldn't risk association with controversial elements. Sarah's Diner lost its wholesale food contracts. Rosa's organic certification came under suspicious review. Even the school district received warnings about state funding tied to community stability metrics that Meridian's development would supposedly improve. The economic siege was accompanied by psychological warfare. Anonymous letters arrived at homes, detailing personal information and veiled threats. Children were bullied at school by classmates whose parents worked for Meridian subsidiaries. Social media filled with posts questioning the farmers' motives, suggesting greed rather than justice drove their claims. Jake found his construction contacts mysteriously unavailable for side jobs he depended on. Former clients apologized, but explained they couldn't risk hiring someone involved in that lawsuit mess. Within weeks, his already precarious financial situation deteriorated toward crisis. "They want us desperate," Walt observed during another strategy session. "Desperate people make bad decisions." But desperation also forged deeper bonds. Families shared resources, trading labor and goods when cash ran short. Sarah's diner became an informal food bank, ensuring no one went hungry despite financial pressure. The community that had been divided by competition over scarce resources united in shared struggle against common oppression. Margaret worked tirelessly, filing motion after motion, building a case that grew stronger even as the community grew weaker. She uncovered a corporate communication from the 1960s where Meridian's predecessor acknowledged the questionable origins of certain land titles, but recommended aggressive defensive posturing against any challenges. "This is what we need," she explained excitedly. "Documented awareness of fraud. They can't claim good faith acquisition when their own records show knowledge of the original theft." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired Meridian accountant, conscience troubled by what he'd witnessed over decades, reached out through Margaret. He provided internal documents showing the company had maintained a secret fund specifically for managing historical title disputes, essentially a war chest for fighting anyone who discovered the truth. More critically, he revealed that Meridian's current development plans were driven by more than profit. Environmental surveys had discovered a massive aquifer under Cedar Valley, water resources that would be worth billions as climate change intensified drought conditions across the Midwest. "They're not just stealing land," Margaret explained to the assembled community. "They're positioning to control water resources that will be critical for the entire region's future." The revelation added new urgency to their fight. This wasn't just about correcting historical injustice. It was about preventing future exploitation that could affect millions beyond Cedar Valley. As winter settled over Kansas, the legal battle entered a critical phase. Margaret had successfully moved the case to federal court, arguing interstate commerce implications. Meridian's attempts to dismiss were denied, forcing them toward the discovery phase they desperately wanted to avoid. But the cost on the community was severe. Several families had been forced to accept Meridian's buyout offers simply to avoid bankruptcy. Others held on through mutual support and stubborn determination, but the strain showed in worried faces and sleepless nights. Jake stood in his workshop one evening, staring at tools he might have to sell to make the next mortgage payment when Emma appeared in the doorway. "Dad, are we going to lose our home?" The question he dreaded finally voiced. Jake struggled for an honest answer that wouldn't crush his daughter's spirit. "We're fighting for what's right, Em. Sometimes that means risking what we have." "Like Great-Grandpa did?" Jake stopped, surprised by the connection. "What do you know about Great-Grandpa?" Emma pulled out a school project, a family history assignment, where she'd interviewed Walt about the old days. "Mr. Brennan told me Great-Grandpa spent years trying to prove something was wrong with the land records. He said Great-Grandpa knew the truth, but couldn't find the proof. And the parallel to their current situation was painfully clear. Jake's father had sensed the injustice, but lacked evidence. Now they had proof, but faced a system designed to protect the theft it had enabled for over a century. "Yes," Jake finally answered, "like Great-Grandpa, some fights are worth having even when they're hard." Maybe the turning point came during a frozen February week when Margaret argued preliminary motions before a federal judge. Meridian's legal team, led by attorneys from the nation's most prestigious firms, presented polished arguments about settled law and economic disruption. But Margaret had something more powerful, the truth, documented in irrefutable detail. She presented the original surveys, the falsified records, the corporate communications acknowledging fraud. She traced the direct line from 1880s theft to present-day exploitation. The judge, an elderly woman who had grown up on an Iowa farm, listened with increasing interest. When Meridian's lead counsel argued that reopening such old claims would create chaos, she interrupted. "Counselor, are you suggesting that the passage of time legitimizes fraud?" The question hung in the courtroom like a challenge. Jake, sitting with other community members in the gallery, felt the first real hope in months. The judge's preliminary ruling sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms across the country. She found sufficient evidence of fraud to proceed with full hearings. More importantly, she issued an injunction preventing any further land transfers in Cedar Valley until the historical claims could be adjudicated. Meridian's stock price plummeted. Other development companies with similar histories suddenly faced scrutiny. Academic researchers and investigative journalists began examining land records in their own regions, finding similar patterns of fraud. But victory in preliminary hearings didn't mean final success. Meridian shifted tactics, offering individual settlements to fragment the community coalition. They approached Jake with a particularly generous offer, full title to 50 acres, the original Morrison allocation, plus enough cash to secure Emma's future. "Think of your daughter," Sterling urged during a private meeting. "You can have everything your family was supposed to get. Why risk it all on some idealistic crusade?" The temptation was real. Jake could end his financial struggles, provide for Emma, honor his family's claim. All he had to do was abandon the community fight and accept a private settlement. That night, Jake stood in his kitchen staring at the offer documents. Emma sat at the table doing homework, unaware of the decision that could change their lives. Outside, snow fell softly on fields that held so much contested history. His phone rang, Walt checking in as he did most evenings. "How you holding up, son?" The simple question brought unexpected tears. Jake had been carrying the weight alone, trying to shield Emma from their precarious situation. "They made an offer, Walt, just to me, everything my family should have had." Silence stretched before Walt responded. "Your father faced the same choice once, not land, but a job offer out of state. Good money, security, everything a struggling family needed. Know why he stayed? Why? Because he understood that some things matter more than personal gain. Community, justice, the kind of legacy that can't be measured in acres." After the call, Jake found Emma watching him with wise eyes that seemed older than her years. "It's about the offer, isn't it? The one that would give us great-grandpa's land?" Jake nodded, surprised she knew. "Sarah Coleman's daughter told me at school. Her mom got one too." Emma set down her pencil. "Dad, remember when you taught me about sharing? How it's not right for one person to have lots while others have nothing. The simple wisdom of a child cut through adult complications. Jake had taught his daughter values that now challenged him to live by them. The next morning, Jake publicly rejected Meridian's offer at a packed community meeting. Others who had received individual settlements followed suit. The corporate strategy of divide and conquer failed against bonds, strengthened by shared struggle. As spring arrived, the full federal hearing began. The courthouse in Wichita filled with Cedar Valley residents, historians, legal scholars, and media drawn to a case that had implications far beyond one Kansas community. Margaret presented a masterful argument, weaving together historical evidence, legal precedent, and human testimony. Elderly residents described generations of struggle on inadequate land. Historians validated document authenticity. Environmental scientists explained the aquifer's significance. Meridian's defense relied on technical arguments and procedural objections. They couldn't refute the fundamental evidence. The original surveys were fraudulent, their claims derived from theft. The judge's final ruling was comprehensive and devastating to Meridian. She found that fraud had indeed occurred, that it had been perpetuated knowingly across generations, and that no statute of limitations protected claims based on deliberate deception. But rather than simply redistributing land according to 1880s surveys, she ordered a complex remedy. A federal trust would be established to manage restored allocations. Communities could choose how to utilize recovered lands, whether through individual ownership, cooperative structures, or conservation reserves. The aquifer discovery led to additional rulings. Water resources would be protected as public trust assets, preventing any single entity from controlling what the judge termed essential commons for future generations. Meridian's empire crumbled. Criminal investigations began into their executives' knowledge of fraud. Other communities, inspired by Cedar Valley's success, launched their own historical challenges. The transformation of Cedar Valley took time. Some families reclaimed ancestral lands. Others chose to participate in cooperative ventures that shared resources and risks. The community center became headquarters for a new agricultural alliance that balanced individual ownership with collective support. Jake found himself with a choice: take full ownership of the Morrison family's original 50 acres or participate in the cooperative structure. He chose a middle path, keeping enough land for sustainable family farming while contributing the rest to community-managed resources. Walt's promise was fulfilled as his expanded acreage became an agricultural education center, teaching sustainable farming methods to new generations. The old tractor, its secret compartment now part of local legend, was restored and displayed as a monument to truth preserved across time. Emma grew up on land her great-grandfather could only dream about, learning both traditional farming and modern conservation techniques. She understood her inheritance included not just soil and water, but responsibility to community and future generations. The Meridian development never materialized. Instead, Cedar Valley became a model for rural communities nationwide, proving that agricultural regions could thrive without surrendering to corporate consolidation. The aquifer protection established precedents for treating water as public heritage rather than private commodity. Years later, as Jake watched Emma graduate from agricultural college, he reflected on the journey that began with helping an elderly neighbor fix a tractor. That simple act of community service had unlocked secrets that changed thousands of lives and challenged fundamental assumptions about property, justice, and progress. Margaret Chen went on to help dozens of other communities uncover their own hidden histories. She often said Cedar Valley proved that truth, no matter how long buried, had power to reshape reality when people found courage to dig it up and defend it. The community center wall now displayed the original survey maps alongside modern collective ownership documents. A plaque honored all who had fought for justice, with special recognition for Walt Brennan, keeper of truth across generations, and Robert Morrison, who searched for what his son would find. But perhaps the most significant monument was less tangible: the transformation of a community from struggling individuals to interconnected whole. Farmers who had competed for scarce resources now shared equipment and knowledge. Children grew up understanding that their heritage included both rights and responsibilities. As for Sterling and Meridian's executives, legal consequences varied. Some faced criminal charges for knowingly perpetuating fraud, others escaped prosecution, but saw their careers end in disgrace. The company itself dissolved, its assets distributed among communities it had exploited. The story of Cedar Valley spread through documentaries, academic studies, and legal textbooks. But for those who lived it, the victory meant simpler things: the ability to farm land without crushing debt, to pass on genuine inheritance to children, to face weather and markets as united community rather than isolated individuals. Jake Morrison, once a struggling single father helping an elderly neighbor with equipment problems, became a nationally recognized advocate for rural justice. But his greatest pride remained local, watching Emma and her generation inherit not just land, but the understanding that community solidarity could overcome systemic injustice. Standing in his fields one evening, observing wheat ready for harvest, on land his family had been denied for generations, Jake remembered his father's frustrated searches through courthouse records. Robert Morrison had sensed the truth, but lacked proof. His persistence, though unsuccessful in his lifetime, had planted seeds of curiosity that bloomed in the next generation. The tractor that started it all still worked Walt's fields, now maintained by the Agricultural Center. Its hidden compartment remained empty, but its story was told to every student who came to learn about farming, history, and the power of preserved truth. Cedar Valley's transformation from struggling farms to thriving agricultural community proved that historical injustices could be corrected when people united behind evidence and principle. The land told a new story now, not of theft and struggle, but of restoration and cooperation. As sunset painted the sky in harvest colors, Jake headed home to dinner with Emma, grateful for the neighbor who had trusted him with secrets, the community that had stood together despite pressure, and the daughter whose simple wisdom had guided his hardest decisions. The road ahead remained challenging, farming always was, but Cedar Valley faced its future with unity, forged in struggle and hope, validated by justice. Sometimes the most profound changes began with the simplest acts, one person helping another, a broken tractor hiding crucial truth, and a community choosing courage over comfort. In the end, the deeds hidden in that secret compartment had indeed changed the county ownership map, but more importantly, they had changed the map of what was possible when ordinary people stood together against extraordinary injustice. The autumn breeze carried the sound of machinery as neighbors helped bring in each other's harvests. Cooperation had replaced competition, shared purpose had overcome individual struggle, and a community had reclaimed not just its land, but its destiny. 1 year after the court's historic decision, Cedar Valley gathered for its first harvest festival as a truly united community. The old grain warehouse that served as the community center had been expanded, its walls now adorned with photographs documenting their struggle and triumph. Jake Morrison stood at the entrance, greeting neighbors whose lives had been transformed by the revelations hidden in Walt's tractor. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," Tom Hawley remarked, setting up tables for the communal feast. His hardware store had not only survived Meridian's boycott, but now thrived as the supply center for the agricultural cooperative. Feels like a lifetime ago. Emma Morrison, now 12 and growing into her role as junior historian for the community, helped arrange displays of historical documents. She had spent the summer interviewing elderly residents, recording stories that might otherwise be lost. Her project, Voices of Cedar Valley, Truth Reclaimed, would be presented at the festival's opening ceremony. Walt Brennan arrived in his restored 1940s pickup, a vehicle that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. At 83, he moved more slowly, but with the satisfaction of someone who had fulfilled a generational promise. The Agricultural Education Center bearing his name had already trained dozens of young farmers in sustainable practices. "Morning, Walt," Jake called out, helping the elderly man with boxes of photographs from the early days of their fight. Margaret Chen's flying in this afternoon. She's bringing someone from the Smithsonian who wants to acquire the tractor for their American history collection. Walt chuckled. That old international harvester in a museum. My grandfather would have never believed it. Though I suppose he never imagined his hiding spot would change history either. The transformation of Cedar Valley extended beyond legal victories and land redistribution. The community had chosen to implement a hybrid system that balanced individual ownership with collective resources. Families could reclaim their full historical allocations or participate in cooperative structures that shared equipment, knowledge, and risk. Rosa Martinez had expanded her organic operation to include a teaching farm where she mentored young farmers in sustainable agriculture. Her original 40 acres had grown to 160, but she had placed 120 into the cooperative trust, using the profits to fund scholarships for local students pursuing agricultural degrees. Community wealth, she explained to visitors, isn't just about individual prosperity. It's about creating systems that benefit everyone while preserving the land for future generations. The Harvest Festival drew attendees from across the country. Academic researchers came to study the Cedar Valley model, as it was being called in agricultural policy circles. Journalists documented the ongoing transformation. Other rural communities sent delegations to learn how historical justice could reshape modern realities. As the morning progressed, Jake found himself pulled into countless conversations. A delegation from Nebraska wanted advice on researching their own land records. Agricultural economists from Kansas State University sought data on the cooperatives' productivity compared to corporate farming models. Environmental scientists were studying how community management affected aquifer conservation. Mr. Morrison, a young journalist approached, recorder in hand. Could you comment on Meridian's latest bankruptcy filing? They're claiming the Cedar Valley case caused their collapse. Jake considered his words carefully. The company's demise had sent ripples through corporate agriculture nationwide. Other development firms now faced scrutiny about their land acquisition practices. Several states had launched investigations into historical land fraud. Meridian collapsed because their business model was built on a foundation of theft and deception, he replied. When that foundation crumbled, everything built on it fell too. The question other companies should ask isn't why Meridian failed, but why they thought fraud could sustain long-term success. The festival's opening ceremony began at noon, with the entire community gathering in the expanded meeting hall. Sarah Coleman, whose diner had survived the corporate boycott through community support, served as master of ceremonies. The walls displayed enlarged copies of both the fraudulent surveys and the original documents, a visual reminder of truth revealed and justice pursued. Emma took the stage with quiet confidence, her presentation weaving together personal stories with historical analysis. She described her great-grandfather's futile search for evidence, her father's decision to help Walt with the tractor, and the moment when hidden documents changed everything. The real treasure wasn't just the papers, she explained to the rapt audience. It was discovering that our community's struggles weren't from natural hardship or personal failures. They were from systematic theft that had been hidden for generations. Knowing the truth, let us change our future. Her presentation included interviews with elderly residents who remembered their grandparents' stories about the early days, tales of prosperity promised but never delivered, of families broken by trying to farm insufficient land, of gradual acceptance that struggle was simply their lot in life. Margaret Chen arrived during Emma's talk, slipping quietly into the back of the hall. The attorney who had guided them through, the legal battle now worked full-time, helping communities uncover historical land fraud. Her presence drew spontaneous applause from those who recognized her. After Emma's presentation, Walt took the stage. The community patriarch had prepared remarks but set them aside, choosing instead to speak from the heart. "My grandfather kept those documents for 90 years, he began, his voice carrying the weight of history. He could have exposed the truth earlier, but knew the system wasn't ready to hear it. He trusted that someday the right people would come along, people with courage to risk everything for justice." His gaze found Jake in the audience. "When Jake Morrison came to fix my tractor, I knew the moment had arrived. Not because he was a legal expert or powerful person, but because he was a neighbor willing to help without expecting anything in return. That's the spirit that made our victory possible, not individual heroism, but community solidarity." The festival continued with tours of transformed properties. The Turner Ranch, once slated for Meridian's shopping complex, now hosted a renewable energy cooperative that powered much of Cedar Valley with wind turbines and solar panels. Bill Tucker's expanded dairy operation had implemented rotational grazing systems that improved soil health while increasing productivity. The hidden aquifer that had attracted Meridian's interest was now protected by federal designation as a strategic water reserve. A management board composed of local residents, scientists, and indigenous representatives oversaw its conservation. The water that corporations had sought to commodify remained a community resource for future generations. Jake led visitors to the Morrison family plot, where he had built a modern house on the original homestead site his great-grandfather had been promised. The 5 acres his family had struggled with for generations were now part of a 50-acre sustainable farming operation that balanced food production with wildlife habitat. "Do you ever regret not taking Meridian's private settlement?" a documentary filmmaker asked, camera capturing the golden afternoon light across fields of ripening grain. Jake looked toward Emma, who was leading a group of children on a nature walk, teaching them to identify native plants. "That offer would have given me personal wealth but fractured our community. What we have now, neighbors helping neighbors, shared resources, common purpose, that's worth more than any private fortune." The filmmaker persisted. "But the financial struggles, the threats, the pressure, wasn't there a moment when you wanted to quit?" "Every day," Jake admitted. "But then I'd remember my father searching through courthouse records, knowing something was wrong but unable to prove it. Or I'd think about Emma's future, whether I wanted her to inherit land or inherit justice." The choice became clear. As evening approached, the festival shifted to celebration. Local musicians played on an outdoor stage, while children ran between booths showcasing Cedar Valley's agricultural products. The organic produce, artisanal cheeses, heritage grain varieties, and craft goods represented not just economic activity, but community renaissance. Margaret Chen found Jake during a quiet moment. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said. "Not just for your courage during the legal battle, but for what you've helped create here. Most court victories end with settlements and disbursements. Cedar Valley chose to build something lasting." "We had good guidance," Jake replied, "and Walt's documents gave us something to build on. But honestly, I think the community was ready. Generations of struggle had prepared us to recognize opportunity when it appeared." They were interrupted by David Sterling's unexpected arrival. The former Meridian CEO had aged considerably, his confident bearing replaced by something more subdued. Criminal charges had been dropped in exchange for cooperation with federal investigators, but his reputation and fortune were gone. "Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize and to understand something. You could have had everything, your family's full land grant, financial security, a private victory. Why did you choose the harder path?" Jake studied the man who had threatened and pressured the community. "Because individual success built on community failure isn't really success. My daughter taught me that. She asked what good it would do to have lots while others had nothing. Sometimes children see truths that adults have learned to ignore. Sterling nodded slowly. I spent my career believing that accumulation of assets was the measure of success. Cedar Valley proved that wrong. You've created more real value here through cooperation than Meridian ever achieved through acquisition. As the festival wound down, Jake found himself on the community center's roof deck with Walt, Tom, Rosa, and other core members of the resistance. The lights of Cedar Valley spread below them, not the harsh glare of commercial development, but the warm glow of homes, farms, and gathering places that served human needs. What happens now? Rosa asked. We've won the legal battle, restructured our community, created new systems, but movements like ours often fade once the crisis passes. Walt leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. That's why we documented everything. Emma's project, the legal archives, the oral histories, they're not just about preserving the past, they're about teaching the future. Every generation will face some version of what we confronted. The question is whether they'll be prepared. Tom Hawley raised his glass of local cider. To the next generation, then. May they be wiser than us, but just as stubborn when it matters. The toast drew laughter and agreement. As the group discussed plans for expanding the Agricultural Education Center, developing renewable energy projects, and mentoring other communities facing similar challenges, Jake felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal gain. Later that night, as Jake tucked Emma into bed, she asked the question that had been forming all day. Dad, do you think other places will find their own hidden truths, like we did with Mr. Brennan's tractor? Jake sat on the edge of her bed considering. I think every community has its secrets, some hidden deliberately, others just forgotten. The question is whether people have the courage to look for them and act on what they find. Will you help them, like Margaret helps other towns now? Would you want me to? Emma nodded firmly. We were lucky Mr. Brennan trusted you with the truth. Other places need someone they can trust too. Her words echoed something Walt had said months earlier. The trust between neighbors was the foundation of everything they'd achieved. Not legal expertise or financial resources, but simple human connection that made sharing dangerous truths possible. As Jake left Emma's room, he found Walt standing on the porch, gazing at stars visible now that Cedar Valley had chosen to limit light pollution. She's right, you know, the old man said without turning. Other communities need what you've learned here, not just about land fraud, but about how neighbors become allies, how individual struggles become collective action. I'm a farmer, Walt, not an activist or organizer. Walt chuckled. I was just an old man with a broken tractor. Look what that led to. Sometimes the most important qualifications are the ones you don't put on a resume. Integrity, persistence, willingness to risk comfort for principle. They stood in comfortable silence, listening to night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The sound carried across fields that had been worked by generations of families, stolen through deception, and finally reclaimed through courage. The tractor's being moved to the Smithsonian next month, Walt mentioned. They want to create an exhibit about grassroots justice movements. Our little international harvester will sit next to artifacts from the civil rights movement and labor organizing campaigns. Jake shook his head in wonder. A hidden compartment in farm equipment changed history. Your grandfather was a genius. He was desperate, Walt corrected. Desperate to preserve truth when all official channels were corrupted. That's often when genius emerges, when normal solutions aren't available and people have to create new possibilities. The conversation drifted to practical matters. Harvest schedules, equipment sharing, plans for winter workshops at the education center. But underneath ran deeper currents about legacy, responsibility, and the ongoing work of justice. A year later, Jake stood before a gathering in Oklahoma, sharing Cedar Valley's story with farmers facing their own corporate pressures. Emma sat in the front row, taking notes for her expanding project on rural justice movements. The Morrison family had found new purpose in helping others discover their own hidden truths. The network that grew from Cedar Valley's victory became known as the Heartland Justice Initiative. Communities across the agricultural belt began examining their own land records, uncovering patterns of fraud that stretched back to the nation's expansion. Not all found documents as complete as Walt's collection, but many discovered enough to challenge current inequities. Corporate agriculture fought back through lobbying, legal challenges, and public relations campaigns. They portrayed the movement as dangerous radicalism that would destabilize food production and property rights. But the narrative had shifted. Rural communities were no longer seen as backward holdouts against progress, but as defenders of sustainable agriculture and economic justice. Emma grew up to become a lawyer, specializing in historical property disputes, following Margaret Chen's path while forging her own. She carried with her the lessons of Cedar Valley, that truth could be hidden but not destroyed, that community solidarity could overcome corporate power, that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Jake aged into his role as an elder statesman of the rural justice movement, always emphasizing that their victory came not from individual heroism, but collective action. He remained a farmer first, working land his family had been denied for generations while helping others reclaim their own heritage. Walt Brennan lived to see his 95th birthday, celebrated at the education center bearing his name. Surrounded by young farmers learning sustainable practices and community organizing, he declared himself satisfied that his grandfather's protected truth had flowered into lasting change. The tractor itself became an icon, its image appearing on logos for agricultural cooperatives nationwide. Museum visitors in Washington learned how a hidden compartment had protected documents that changed thousands of lives and challenged fundamental assumptions about American property law. But the real monument to their struggle wasn't in museums or courtrooms. It lived in the transformed relationships of Cedar Valley. Neighbors who shared resources instead of competing for scraps, young. People who stayed to farm instead of fleeing to cities. A community that faced challenges together instead of suffering in isolation. On quiet evenings, Jake would walk his expanded fields, feeling the presence of ancestors who had worked the same soil under conditions of artificial scarcity. Their struggles hadn't been in vain, but had created the pressure that eventually burst. The dam of deception. The prairie wind carried whispers of the past and promises for the future. In barns and machine sheds across the heartland, farmers looked at their equipment with new eyes, wondering what secrets might be hidden in plain sight. What truths waited to transform their world? Cedar Valley had proved that even the mightiest corporate structures could crumble when communities united around evidence of injustice. The land that had been stolen through paperwork and lies had been reclaimed through solidarity and courage. And in that reclamation lay hope for every community facing similar battles against concentrated power. The story that began with a broken tractor and a neighborly favor had become a beacon for rural America. It showed that ordinary people, armed with truth and united in purpose, could rewrite maps that had seemed permanent, challenge systems that appeared invincible, and create futures that honored both heritage and justice. As the sun set on another harvest day in Cedar Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, the community gathered as they did each season to share food, stories, and plans for tomorrow. Children played in fields their parents had fought to reclaim. Elderly voices shared memories across generations. And in the center of it all, the spirit of mutual aid that had made everything possible continued to flourish. The hidden compartment in Walt's tractor was empty now, its secrets revealed and its purpose fulfilled. but the space it had protected for so long had given birth to something that could never be hidden again. The knowledge that truth, however long suppressed, retained the power to transform reality when people found the courage to uncover and defend it. The harvest was complete, but the seeds of justice planted in Cedar Valley continued to spread across the prairie, taking root wherever communities chose solidarity over submission, wherever neighbors decided that their shared future mattered more than individual escape. And in that spreading growth lay the real victory. Not just land reclaimed, but hope restored. Not just rights recovered, but community reborn. In the end, the greatest discovery wasn't the documents hidden in an old tractor, but the strength that emerged when ordinary people stood together against extraordinary injustice. That strength, once awakened, proved impossible to hide or destroy. It lived on in every field worked by its rightful owner, every cooperative venture that put community before profit, every child who grew up knowing their heritage included both struggle and triumph. The map of Cedar Valley had indeed been rewritten, but more importantly, the story of what was possible when neighbors helped neighbors had been written into the hearts of all who witnessed or participated in their transformation. And that story, like the prairie wind that carried it, knew no boundaries. The stars emerged one by one above Cedar Valley, ancient lights that had watched over the land through all its changes. Below them, a community that had found its way. Back to justice continued the eternal work of cultivation, of soil, of relationships, of hope itself. The harvest was gathered, but the planting never truly ended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Cedar Valley faced them with the confidence of people who had already achieved the impossible. They had turned a broken tractor into a key that unlocked history, transformed neighbors into allies, and converted hidden truth into living justice. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. The autumn air carried the scent of earth and growing things, of dinners cooking in kitchens across the valley, of life continuing in its ancient rhythms, but on terms the community had chosen for itself. In that choosing, in that reclaiming of agency stolen generations ago, lay the deepest victory of all. And in the distance, barely visible in the gathering darkness, the silhouette of an old International Harvester tractor stood in the museum-bound collection, its secret compartment empty, but its legacy eternal. A reminder that even the smallest acts of neighborly kindness could carry the seeds of transformation, that hidden truths waited patiently for their moment of revelation, and that justice, though long delayed, would not be forever denied. The story of Cedar Valley had become part of the larger American narrative, challenging comfortable myths about property and progress, while affirming older truths about community and courage. It proved that the past was never truly past, that its injustices echoed through generations until confronted, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to exercise it together. As the last light faded from the western sky, Cedar Valley settled into peaceful evening. Porch lights flickered on across the landscape, each one marking a home, a family, a piece of the community that had refused to surrender its future to corporate design. The hidden compartment had given up its secrets, but the community had discovered something even more valuable, its own capacity for transformation. And that discovery, more than any legal document or court ruling, was the true inheritance passed from generation to generation. It was the knowledge that neighbors helping neighbors could change history, that truth would eventually surface no matter how deeply buried, and that justice was not a gift from above, but a harvest cultivated by human hands working together in common cause. The night deepened over Cedar Valley, stars wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns, while below, the community that had rewritten its map continued the patient work of growing crops, relationships, possibilities. The seeds planted by one act of neighborly assistance, had flowered into a movement that would continue bearing fruit for generations to come. In the end, that was the secret worth preserving. Not hidden documents, but revealed humanity, not individual triumph, but collective liberation, not the map as it had been drawn by power and deception, but as it could be redrawn by truth and solidarity. Cedar Valley had found its future by reclaiming its past, and in doing so had shown the way for others to follow. The prairie wind continued its ancient conversation with the land, carrying stories from farm to farm, season to season, generation to generation. And woven through all those stories now was the tale of the tractor with the hidden compartment, the neighbor who offered help without thought of reward, and the community that discovered its greatest treasure was each other. Dawn would come again to Cedar Valley, as it had for countless mornings before and would for countless mornings to come. But it would rise on a community transformed, a landscape reclaimed, and a future being written by its rightful authors. The harvest was complete, the truth revealed, and the real work, the eternal work of building just and sustainable community, continued with each new day. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.